The sky over Dusty Creek was the color of rust and forgetting. For 3 months, it had offered no promise of rain, only a relentless, brassy glare that baked the cracked earth and frayed the nerves of every soul trapped below. The wind, when it came, was no relief. It was a hot, gritty breath that carried the scent of sun-scorched creosote and despair, swirling the fine red dust into every corner of the one-street settlement, into the lungs and onto the tongues of its inhabitants. It was a silence waiting to be broken by a gunshot. Abigail Hayes felt the grit between her teeth and ignored it. She had learned to ignore much in her 28 years, most of it during the long, punishing journey with the wagon train now circled at the edge of town. She wiped a sheen of sweat from her brow with the back of a capable hand, her gaze sweeping over the collection of canvas-topped wagons and weary travelers. They were leaving tomorrow, moving on to the greener promises of California, leaving Dusty Creek to its thirst and its simmering violence. She should have been relieved. Instead, a peculiar disquiet settled in her bones, as heavy as the unmoving air. As the train's nurse, her duty was to the families who had hired her, to see them through the fevers, the broken bones, and the heartaches of the trail. She had done her job, but Dusty Creek clung to her thoughts. It was a wound of a town, festering in the heat, a place where men's eyes were hard and watchful, and the only law seemed to be the speed of a man's draw. She had seen it in the face of a boy with a badly set arm, in the exhausted eyes of a woman who had buried a child without a proper marker. This place needed more than a passing nurse. It needed a foundation, a place of healing. The thought was absurd, a fool's dream born of trail fatigue. Her future was west, with the others. With a deep sigh, she pushed aside the flap of her medical tent, the temporary infirmary she had established upon their arrival. The air inside was stifling, thick with the smells of carbolic acid, dried herbs, and human suffering. She checked on her last patient from the wagon train, a girl sleeping off a fever, and felt a familiar pull. This was her purpose, the only one she had ever known with certainty, to mend what was broken. Dismissing the urge to start packing, she decided to walk. She needed to clear her head, to find some plant or root that might be of use. She followed a dry wash away from the town, her worn leather boots sinking into the loose sand. The sun beat down, and the silence was profound, broken only by the buzz of an unseen insect and the soft crunch of her footsteps. Red rock mesas rose in the distance, their flat tops shimmering in the heat haze. It was a hard, beautiful, unforgiving land. That was when she saw the splash of crimson against the dun-colored earth. It was not a flower. She approached cautiously, her hand resting near the small utility knife she wore at her belt. Tucked into the shallow shade of an overhanging rock lay a man, an Apache. His body was tense, coiled even in stillness. A dark, ugly stain spread across the deerskin tunic covering his thigh, and his face was a mask of pain, tight and pale beneath his sun-darkened skin. His black hair was matted with sweat and dust, and his eyes, when they flickered open to watch her, were as sharp and wary as a hawk's. For a long moment, they simply stared. Abigail saw no weapon near him, only a man losing a battle against a bad wound. The people in town, and many on the wagon train, would have told her to turn around, to leave him to his fate. An Apache was trouble, they would say, but Abigail did not see an Apache. She saw a patient. She slowly knelt, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. She held up her empty hands. "I am a nurse," she said, her voice steady and calm. "I can help you. The wound is infected." He said nothing, his gaze unwavering. He did not understand her words, but he understood her tone. He watched as she unstrapped the medical satchel from her shoulder and opened it. Every tool she revealed, every bottle she uncapped, was scrutinized by those dark, intelligent eyes. She worked with an efficient grace born of long practice, cleaning the torn flesh with practiced hands. It was a deep gash, inflamed and angry, likely from a fall against sharp rock. He flinched when she probed it, a sharp intake of breath, his only sound, but he did not move to stop her. She packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow to stop the bleeding and fight the infection, then bound it tightly with clean strips of linen. His breathing was shallow, his skin hot to the touch. He had a fever. He needed water, rest, and a better shelter than the meager shade of a rock. Making a decision that felt both foolish and profoundly necessary. She put her hands under his arms. "You have to get up," she said gently, as if he could understand. "I cannot leave you here." He was lean but wiry, and with a low groan, he used his arms to help her. The journey back to the edge of town was a slow, agonizing ordeal. He leaned heavily on her, his weight a solid, grounding presence. By the time they reached her tent, the sun was beginning to dip, painting the dusty sky in violent shades of orange and purple. She helped him onto the empty cot, the one the feverish girl had vacated just that morning, and he collapsed, his eyes closing in exhaustion. Abigail stood over him, breathing heavily, her own muscles aching. The wagon train was leaving at dawn, and she had just brought the very trouble everyone warned her against right into her camp. The wagon master, a grizzled man named Jedediah, found her as she was boiling water over her small fire. His face, a roadmap of wrinkles carved by sun and worry, was set in grim lines. "Abigail," he began, his voice low, "the folks are getting restless. We ride out with the sun." He paused, looking toward her tent. "What have you done?" The question was not an accusation. Not yet. It was a plea for a sensible explanation. Abigail looked from his weary face to the closed flap of her tent, where a man from a hunted people lay fighting for his life. She thought of the journey ahead, of the ocean she had never seen. Then she thought of the raw, desperate need of this place. "I am staying. Jedediah," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "There is work for me here." He stared at her as if she had grown a second head. "Staying in this pit, Abigail. These are not our people. There is nothing here but dust and trouble." "There are sick people," she countered, "and injured ones. There is no doctor for 100 miles. I can make a difference here." With him, Jedediah jerked his chin toward the tent. "Do you know what they will say? What they will think?" "I know what is right," she replied simply. "My skills are needed. I cannot turn my back." He argued for another 10 minutes, but he saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes and finally gave up with a heavy, defeated sigh. "I cannot force you, but it is a mistake, Abigail, a terrible mistake." He left her then, and she watched him go, feeling a pang of loss for the community she was leaving behind, but a stronger feeling, one of purpose, settled over her. She would make this work. She would build something lasting, an infirmary, a place of refuge. The news of her decision, and the reason for it, spread through the wagon train and the town like a brush fire. Whispers followed her as she moved about her work. Some looked at her with grudging respect, others with open suspicion. The townspeople were a mixed lot. A few, like the blacksmith's wife whose son she had treated, brought her a small sack of flour and a jug of precious water. Most kept their distance, their faces closed and wary. And then there was Silas Maddox. He was a man who moved as if he owned the ground he walked on, dressed in a tailored suit that defied the dust and heat. He projected an aura of wealth and unshakable confidence. He was a land speculator, they said, buying up tracts of territory for the railroad or some eastern syndicate. He had a particular interest in the valley and its water sources, especially the one they called Coyote Spring, a place the Apache considered sacred and essential for their survival. Abigail saw him for the first time 2 days after the wagon train had departed, leaving her in a cloud of dust and profound solitude. Maddox rode a fine black horse and was flanked by 2 hard-faced men with rifles resting easy in their saddle scabbards. He stopped a short distance from her tent, his gaze taking in the simple setup, lingering on the flap as if he could see right through it. His smile was thin, a mere stretching of the lips that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. He did not speak to her. He did not have to. His presence was a statement, a claim. He and his men were a constant, unnerving sight over the next few days, a self-appointed patrol that circled the valley, their purpose vague and menacing. They were keeping the peace. They claimed, looking for Apache raiders, but their real purpose was clear to Abigail. They were an occupying force, tightening a noose around the native people, pressuring them, pushing them away from the water, pushing them toward a confrontation. Her patient, whose name she learned was Nantan, slowly began to heal. He spoke little English, but they communicated through gestures, through the universal language of patient and caregiver. He was proud and observant, his dignity intact despite his helplessness. He watched her every move, and in his eyes, she saw not just gratitude, but a deep, sorrowful wisdom. He knew what was happening outside the tent. He could feel the pressure building, just as she could. The tension came to a head on a blistering afternoon 1 week after she had made her choice to stay. The copper sky seemed to press down on the small tent, making the air thick and hard to breathe. 2 of Maddox's men dismounted in front of her infirmary. They were large, unshaven men who smelled of sweat and cheap whiskey. The taller one, a man with a jagged scar on his cheek, stepped forward. "The lady nurse?" he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near her boot. "Mr. Maddox wants a word." Abigail stepped out of the tent, placing herself between them and the entrance, her heart thumping a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "I am busy. If Mr. Maddox wants to speak with me, he can come himself." The man chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "He is a busy man. He sent us. We hear you are keeping company with an Apache." "I am treating a patient," she said, her voice level, betraying none of the fear coiling in her stomach. "That patient is a wanted man," the second man chimed in. "A danger to this town. We are here to take him into custody." Abigail's spine stiffened. She looked from one leering face to the other. This was the moment Jedediah had warned her about. This was her terrible mistake, or her defining stand. "He is under my care," she stated, her chin lifting. "He is unwell and unarmed. He is a threat to no one. You will not enter this tent." The scarred man took a step closer. His sheer size an intimidation tactic. That was not a request. "We have orders. Give us the savage, or we will take him, and we will not be gentle about it." The world seemed to shrink to the small space between them. The heat, the dust, the hostile eyes of the town watching from a distance. Inside the tent, Nantan was helpless. She was all that stood between him and them. Her mind raced. She had no weapon, no authority. All she had was the fierce, unyielding conviction that what she was doing was right. "This is an infirmary," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she did not know she possessed. "A place of healing. You are not welcome here. Leave, now." The man's eyes narrowed, and his hand moved toward the pistol at his hip. The air crackled, thick with unspoken violence. The silent, copper sky watched, holding its breath. The storm was no longer coming. It had arrived. The scarred man's hand hovered over his pistol, a silent, loaded threat in the oppressive heat. Abigail Hayes did not flinch. She held his gaze, her own a steady blue flame. The standoff stretched, thin and taut, from the corner of her eye. She saw movement at the saloon door, the glint of the sun on the sheriff's star. Sheriff Caleb Hart moved with the unhurried gait of a man who had seen too much to ever be surprised. He was older, his face weathered, but his eyes missed nothing. He stopped a few feet away, his presence shifting the balance of power. "Having some trouble here, boys?" he asked, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. The scarred man, whose name was Boone, turned his head slightly. "Sheriff, just carrying out Mr. Maddox's business. This woman is harboring a hostile." "This woman is running an infirmary," Hart corrected him, his gaze flicking to Abigail and then back to Boone. "And the man inside is her patient. This is still a United States territory. not Maddox's private kingdom. The law says she has a right to conduct her business in peace. Now, I suggest you and your friend go find some shade." Boone hesitated, his jaw working. He shot Abigail a look of pure venom before finally backing down. He and his partner mounted their horses and rode off, leaving a cloud of red dust and simmering resentment in their wake. Abigail let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She gave the sheriff a nod of gratitude. "Thank you, Sheriff Hart." "Do not thank me yet," he said, his eyes troubled. That was just the opening move. "Maddox is a patient man when it comes to getting what he wants. Be careful, ma'am." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving her alone with the silence and the weight of her decision. Inside the tent, Nantan was sitting up on the cot, his face grim. He had heard everything. A few days later, his leg now strong enough to bear his weight for short periods. He spoke to her, his English slow but deliberate, pieced together from encounters at trading posts and missions. "My people," he said, his voice low, "the children. A sickness of the lung comes with the dust. Your medicine, it is needed." He explained that his small settlement was in the canyons beyond Red Mesa, and that Maddox's patrols had effectively cut them off, preventing anyone from reaching the town for supplies. Abigail looked at her dwindling stock of quinine and laudanum. It was not much, but it might be enough to turn the tide for a few. "How can we get past Maddox's men?" "They watch the main trail," Nantan said, a faint light in his eyes. "They do not know the high paths, the goat trails. I can guide you, but it is a hard journey." The thought was daunting. The wilderness of this territory was a formidable enemy, but the image of sick children, combined with her growing defiance of Silas Maddox, solidified her resolve. "I will pack a bag," she said. They left before dawn 2 days later, slipping away from Dusty Creek under the cover of a moonless sky. Nantan, though still favoring his injured leg, moved with a silent, fluid grace that made Abigail feel clumsy and loud. He led her not toward the open plains, but into a narrow, winding canyon that seemed to eat the starlight. The air grew cooler as they ascended, the path a mere suggestion of a trail snaking between towering walls of dark red rock. For the first few hours, they moved in silence, conserving their energy. As the sun rose, it did not illuminate the path, but rather set the tops of the mesas ablaze with a brilliant, fiery light, leaving them in the deep purple shadows below. It was here, in the quiet intimacy of the trail, that they began to talk. He taught her the true names of the land. The flat-topped mountain was not just Red Mesa. It was Dil-Lichi, the place where the setting sun bleeds. The dry wash they crossed was not simply a wash. It was a memory of the last great flood, a story of survival. He showed her how to read the clouds, not as mere puffs of white, but as messages from the sky. A wisp here meant wind in the high passes. A thickening there warned of a storm gathering beyond the horizon. It was a language she had never known existed, a way of seeing the world not as a collection of objects, but as a living, breathing entity. In turn, Abigail spoke of her own world. She explained how the tiny organisms in a drop of water, invisible to the eye, could bring sickness or health. She described the meticulous order of the human body, the way bones knit and fevers break. He listened with a focused intensity, his questions sharp and insightful. He did not dismiss her knowledge as foreign magic, but sought to understand its structure, its own kind of logic. A bridge of mutual respect was being built, step by patient step, across a chasm of culture and experience. The land grew more rugged as they climbed. The air thinned. By midday, the sky, which had been a clear, brilliant blue, began to show signs of the change Nantan had predicted. The clouds thickened, their bellies turning a bruised, slate gray. The wind picked up, moaning through the rock formations. "We must find shelter," Nantan said, his eyes scanning the canyon walls. "A storm comes, a bad one." He urged her forward, his pace quickening. They were crossing a wide, sandy arroyo when the first drops of rain fell, fat and cold, kicking up puffs of dust. Then came the hail. Small pellets at first, then stones the size of marbles that stung her skin and rattled against the rocks. The sky opened with a deafening roar, and the rain came down in a solid, blinding sheet. Within minutes, the dry wash transformed. A low rumble became a roar as a wall of brown, churning water, thick with mud and debris, came surging down the arroyo. Abigail froze, mesmerized by the terrifying power of the flood. Nantan grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "This way now," he yelled over the thunder of the water. He pulled her toward the steep canyon wall, scrambling over slick, wet rocks. The water was already at their ankles, its pull a greedy, insistent force. She slipped, her boot finding no purchase. For a heart-stopping second, she felt the current grab her, pulling her off her feet, but Nantan's grip held, with a strength she would not have thought possible. He half-dragged, half-lifted her up onto a wide ledge 10 feet above the torrent. They collapsed onto the rock, gasping for breath, soaked to the bone, as the flash flood raged below them. A monstrous, liquid beast. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived. It left behind a world washed clean, the air cool and smelling of wet earth and sage. But the flood had taken a toll. As Nantan moved to check their path, he winced, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his lips. Abigail saw that the rough scramble had torn the bandage on his leg. The wound, once clean and healing, was now smeared with dirty, gritty mud. "Sit down," she commanded gently. They found a shallow cave carved into the rock, a space just large enough to shelter them from the lingering drizzle. In the dim light, she carefully unwrapped the soiled linen. The skin around the gash was red and swollen. The infection was returning. "This is not good," she murmured, her face creased with worry. "We have to clean it properly." Working with what little she had, she used precious water from her canteen and the last of her carbolic solution to cleanse the wound. He sat perfectly still, his jaw tight against the pain, watching her hands as they worked with a focused tenderness. She made a new poultice from herbs she'd gathered along the trail and bound the leg with the last of her clean linen. As she finished, their eyes met. A silent understanding passed between them. He had saved her from the water. She had, for the second time, saved him from the poison in his own blood. They rested for a few hours, waiting for the water in the arroyo to recede. As evening approached, Nantan decided they should scout a new path from a higher vantage point. They climbed to a ridge that overlooked a wide valley. From there, in the fading light, they saw them. A small group of horsemen, perhaps half a dozen, were circling a small, isolated Apache camp. They were dressed in a mockery of military uniforms, a collection of faded blue coats and worn cavalry hats. They were shouting, firing their guns into the air, driving off the few animals the family owned. Abigail felt a cold knot of dread in her stomach. It was a deliberate provocation, cruel and pointless. She watched their movements, her brows furrowed. Something was wrong. Their riding was sloppy, their formations non-existent. They looked less like soldiers and more like— "They are not soldiers," Nantan whispered beside her, his voice a low growl of fury. "I know 2 of those men. They drink at the saloon in Dusty Creek. They work for Maddox." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This was Maddox's strategy. He was not just pressuring the Apache, he was creating fake incidents, dressing his hired thugs up as cavalry to stir up conflict. He was manufacturing a war, painting the Apache as aggressors, all to give the territorial government a reason to step in and drive them from their land, leaving Coyote Spring and the valley ripe for his claim. The sheer, cynical evil of the plan took her breath away. The weight of this new knowledge was crushing. To speak of it would be to accuse a powerful man of a terrible crime. Who in Dusty Creek would believe her? The outsider, the Apache sympathizer. Over the wealthy Silas Maddox she would be called a liar, a madwoman. The danger she was in would multiply tenfold. Beside her, Nantan was shaking with a barely controlled rage. This attack on a helpless family, the insult of the uniforms, it was a profound dishonor that screamed for vengeance. She could feel the struggle within him, the pull of the warrior's path against the dawning realization that a direct fight was exactly what Maddox wanted. They retreated from the ridge as darkness fell. The ugly scene seared into their minds. They found their way back to the small cave, the silence between them thick with unspoken fears and violent emotions. The world felt dangerous and unstable, balanced on a knife's edge. Abigail shivered. Though the air was no longer cold, she leaned back against the cool, solid wall of the cave. Her hand, still covered in drying mud from their escape, rested on the stone beside her. Nantan sat down near her, his own anger slowly banking into a grim, hard resolve. He leaned his head back and placed his own muddy hand on the rock, just inches from hers. The two handprints, stark and earthy against the pale stone, seemed to hold the weight of the entire day, the journey, the storm, the rescue, the horrifying discovery. "We saw the truth today," Abigail whispered into the darkness, her voice trembling slightly. Nantan was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the dripping of water from the rocks. "When the time is right," he finally said, his voice quiet but resonant with certainty. "The rocks will speak it." His handprint next to hers was not a touch, not a caress, but something more. It was a promise, sealed in mud and stone, a pledge to bear witness. They were no longer just a nurse and a patient, a white woman and an Apache man. They were allies, bound by a shared secret and a common, formidable enemy. The journey back from Red Mesa was a descent into a different kind of wilderness. The canyons had been clean, the dangers honest. Dusty Creek was a landscape of veiled glances and whispered judgments. Abigail Hayes and Nantan parted ways at the edge of the foothills, a silent nod passing between them that was heavier than any spoken word. He melted back into the rocks and shadows that were his home, and she walked into the simmering cauldron of the town, the secret of what they had witnessed a cold, hard stone in her gut. The change in the town was immediate and palpable. It was centered around Coyote Spring. Silas Maddox had wasted no time, where there had once been an open, dusty trail leading to the life-giving pool of water. There now stood a formidable wooden gate. It was made of thick, raw timber, braced with iron, and looked more like a fortress entrance than an access point to a natural spring. A heavy, rust-colored chain was looped through the gate and secured with a large, brutal-looking padlock. To one side, a freshly painted sign was hammered into the hard earth, in stark black letters. It read, "Property of the Dusty Creek Water and Land Company. Access fee 2 bits per barrel. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted under Territorial Statute 113B. Justice, Abigail thought with a bitter taste in her mouth, had been locked away for the price of a cheap chain. The statute was meaningless legal jargon, a shield of legitimacy for an act of pure theft. The spring had always been open, a shared resource for traveler, settler, and Apache alike. Now, it was a commodity. Her first stop was the general store, a long, low building that smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and dust. Esther Pike, the proprietor, was a widow in her 40s with kind, tired eyes and hands that were never still. She was measuring out a length of calico fabric when Abigail entered. She looked up, and a flicker of relief crossed her face. "You are back," Esther said, her voice low. "We were worried." The talk, she let the sentence trail off, her gaze darting toward 2 other women in the store who fell silent and suddenly found the pickle barrel intensely interesting. "The journey was successful," Abigail said, keeping her voice neutral. "The children received their medicine." Esther nodded, then leaned forward over the counter. "He did it, then, Maddox. He put up the gate yesterday morning. Claimed he was making improvements for the town's benefit." She snorted. A small, unladylike sound of disgust. Some benefit. The Apache came for water this morning. A woman and her 2 small children. Boone and his friends turned them away. Said the fee was 2 bits. payable in coin only. The injustice of it was a physical blow. The Apache had no use for coin. It was a ban disguised as a business transaction. Did Sheriff Hart do nothing? Abigail asked, her voice tight. What could he do? Esther sighed. Folding the calico. Maddox filed a claim on the land. He has papers. Caleb Hart can only enforce the law as it is written on those papers, not as it should be in the heart of a good man. The bell over the door jingled, and a man Abigail had never seen before entered. He was slight, with a neat suit and an overly eager expression. He carried a small notepad and pencil. He tipped his hat to the room. Ladies, my name is Phineas Dole, correspondent for the Arizona Territorial Spectator. Just gathering some local color for a piece on the progress of this fine community. His eyes landed on Abigail, and a predatory gleam entered them. And you must be the celebrated nurse, Abigail Hayes. I have heard so much about your charitable work. Before Abigail could respond, Silas Maddox himself walked in, clapping Phineas on the shoulder. Phineas, my boy, just the man I wanted to see. Let me buy you a drink over at the saloon. We have much to discuss about the bright future of Dusty Creek. Maddox's eyes slid over Abigail, cold and dismissive, as if she were a piece of furniture. He was in complete control, and he knew it. He was not just stealing the water. He was writing the story about it, ensuring his version was the only one that would be told. That evening, the town's division became starkly clear. The saloon was Maddox's parliament, loud with boastful laughter and the clink of glasses. Abigail, walking past on the far side of the street, could hear his voice carrying on the hot, still air, talking of investment, security, and the taming of the wilderness. His hired men, Boone among them, were his loyal constituents, their loyalty purchased with whiskey and silver dollars. Phineas Dole was at his side, scribbling furiously in his notepad, a willing scribe for the gospel of greed. The opposition met in quieter, more somber places. A few concerned ranchers and homesteaders gathered near the church after evening services, their voices low and troubled. The Reverend Michael, a young man with a face too earnest for this hard country, spoke of a different kind of law, one that commanded men to be stewards of the earth and keepers of their brothers. Esther Pike was there, along with the blacksmith and his wife. They spoke of tradition, of fairness, of a fear that Maddox's brand of progress would poison the soul of the community long before it enriched its pockets. But their voices were hesitant, their power uncertain. They were a congregation of conscience, not a company with legal papers and hired guns. 2 days later, the first stone was cast directly at Abigail. Phineas Dole's article arrived with the weekly mail coach. A copy was nailed prominently to the wall of the saloon, and another to the public notice board. The headline was Sensational Dusty Creek's Angel or Apache Adversary. The article was a masterpiece of insinuation and veiled accusation. It praised her nursing skills in one sentence, only to question her judgment in the next. It spoke of her unusual and solitary trip into the wilderness with a known Apache hostile. It quoted anonymous concerned citizens who worried about her loyalties. It painted her as a naive, misguided woman whose compassion for the natives was a danger to the good, law-abiding people of the town. Reading it, Abigail felt a cold fury mixed with a profound sense of violation. Her work, her very character, had been twisted into something ugly and suspect. The effect was immediate. People who had once greeted her with a nod now looked away as she passed. A mother who had asked her to check on a colicky baby sent her son to say she was no longer needed. The small acts of kindness, the sacks of flour and jugs of water, stopped. Late one night, a rock clattered against the canvas of her tent, a small, cowardly act of violence that left her shaken and utterly alone. She went to Sheriff Hart. She found him in his small, cluttered office, a place that smelled of stale coffee and old paperwork. She threw a copy of the newspaper onto his desk. "This is a lie, Sheriff," she said, her voice shaking with controlled anger. "All of it. Maddox is behind this. He is trying to drive me out, to silence me because I know what he is." Caleb Hart picked up the paper and read it slowly, his expression unchanging. He folded it carefully and set it aside. "There is no crime in writing an article. Abigail, it is just words. Words are weapons here. He is turning the entire town against me. He has stolen the only clean water source from people who need it to survive. And he is using this slander to justify it. You have to do something." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in protest. His face looked every one of its 60 years. "I told you, my hands are tied. Maddox has a legal claim, filed and stamped. I cannot tear down his gate without an order from a territorial judge. As for this article, it is full of opinions and questions, not provable falsehoods. There is nothing for the law to grab hold of. He is smart. Abigail, he fights his battles with paper and ink, not just with guns." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a deep frustration in his eyes. "I do not like it. But my badge means I uphold the law, the whole of it. Not just the parts I find just defeated." She left his office. The law was a shield for men like Maddox, not a sword for people like her. She needed to warn Nantan, under the sliver of a new moon. She walked out to the prearranged spot, a lone mesquite tree in a shallow ravine. He was there, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. She told him everything: the gate, the article, the town's fear. His face, when she could see it in the dim light, was a mask of cold fury. His hand rested on the handle of the knife at his belt. "This cannot stand," he said, his voice a low growl. "My people are thirsty. His lies put you in danger. It is time for a warrior's response." "No," Abigail said, placing a hand on his arm, feeling the tense muscle beneath the deerskin. "That is what he wants. Nantan, he wants you to attack. He wants a fight. It would prove everything he has been saying is true. It would bring the real cavalry down on your people. We cannot fight him with knives and arrows." "Then how do we fight?" he demanded, his voice raw with frustration. "We wait. We die of thirst while he grows rich." "We fight him with the truth," she insisted, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "We made a promise. On the mesa, we tell them what we saw. We expose him for the liar and murderer he is trying to be." He looked at her, his internal battle clear in the taut line of his jaw. The pressure from his people, their suffering, their demand for action, weighed heavily on him. But he had seen the wisdom in her words before. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. "The truth is a slow arrow." "But it flies straight," she countered. Their conversation was cut short by the distant sound of a shod horse. They separated without another word, melting back into their separate, hostile worlds. The final blow came 3 days later. Abigail was tending to her small herb garden behind the tent when Sheriff Hart's shadow fell over her. He was holding a folded piece of official-looking paper. His face was grim. "I am sorry about this, Abigail," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Truly, I am." He handed her the paper. It was a legal summons. Silas Maddox, on behalf of the Dusty Creek Water and Land Company, had filed a formal complaint against her. It accused her of trespassing, inciting public unrest, and conspiring with hostile natives to undermine the legal commerce and security of the community. She was being sued. She stared at the document, the dense legal text blurring before her eyes. It was absurd, a complete inversion of the truth. But it was official. It was the law. Maddox had not just locked away the water behind a chain. He had now locked Abigail herself in a cage of legal paper, and the whole town was watching to see what she would do. The legal papers felt heavier than a tombstone in Abigail Hayes's hands. The lawsuit was a clever trap, designed not to win in a courtroom but to bleed her dry of what little credibility and resources she possessed. It was a public branding. She was no longer just the town nurse. She was a defendant, a troublemaker, a woman officially accused of siding with the enemy. The chill in the air had nothing to do with the changing season. It was the cold shoulder of Dusty Creek. Then the sky turned white. The first snow came not as a gentle dusting, but as a sudden, serious blizzard that swept down from the mountains without warning. It was a thick, wet snow that silenced the world, burying the red dust under a blanket of pristine, deceptive purity. For 3 days, the storm raged. The town huddled indoors, and Abigail was trapped in her tent, the canvas straining against the wind. Her world reduced to a small, flickering circle of lantern light. The isolation was a physical presence, a constant reminder of her position. Was she a part of the town hunkering down against the storm, or was she a solitary outpost, belonging to no one at all? The question gnawed at her, a hollow ache in her chest, where in this vast, hard land was her home. When the storm finally broke, it left behind a world of blinding white and brutal cold. The fight for survival shifted from a battle against thirst to a war against the frost. Firewood became more precious than gold, and with the cold came the sickness. It started in the Apache camps, tucked away in their winter shelters, weakened by a poor harvest and the lack of access to Coyote Springs' clean water. News of the plague arrived in the form of a ghost, an Apache woman. Her face gaunt with fear and exhaustion, stumbled into town at dawn. She was half frozen, wrapped in a single thin blanket, and she collapsed in the snow in front of Esther Pike's general store. Esther and Abigail carried her inside, laying her by the pot-bellied stove, between racking coughs that shook her frail body. The woman spoke of a fever that burned through her people, especially the children and the elders, a sickness of the chest that stole the breath, pneumonia. In the close, smoky confines of the winter lodges, it would spread like fire in dry grass. The woman's arrival split the town anew. Some, their fears stoked by Maddox's campaign, saw her as an omen of attack, a scout for a raiding party. Boone and his cronies swaggered around the saloon, talking loudly of forming a militia to protect the town's perimeter. But others saw something else. They saw a desperate mother. They saw a human being freezing in the snow. For Abigail, there was no choice. The lawsuit, the whispers, the glares, they all faded into irrelevance. Her purpose was singular and clear. She gathered her medical supplies, her mind already calculating dosages and treatments. But she knew she could not do this alone. She needed help. She needed a team. Her first stop was Esther Pike. The widow listened, her face grim, as Abigail laid out her plan. "I need supplies, Esther, blankets, food, and more importantly, I need hands. I cannot nurse an entire camp by myself." Esther looked out the window at the snow-piled street. Her husband had been taken by a fever 5 winters ago. She knew the hollow, helpless feeling of watching a loved one fight for breath. "Maddox will not like this," she said, not as a refusal, but as a statement of fact. "He will say we are aiding the enemy." "They are sick people," Abigail said simply. "That is all I see." Esther turned from the window, a new resolve in her eyes. "My husband always said you do not measure a person by who their friends are, but by who their enemies are. If Silas Maddox is our enemy for doing this, then we are in good company." She began to stack tins of condensed milk on the counter. "I will come with you." Their second recruit was the Reverend Michael. He was a young man, full of scripture and ideals that had yet to be hardened by the frontier. When Abigail explained the situation, his face filled with a pained sincerity. He saw the crisis not as a political conflict, but as a moral test. He agreed to come, to offer what comfort he could, and to help carry the supplies. This small, unlikely alliance, the outcast nurse, the pragmatic widow, and the idealistic preacher, became a source of intense debate in the town. They were a visible counterpoint to Maddox's narrative of fear. As they loaded a small wagon with supplies from Esther's store, a crowd gathered. Some watched with open hostility, others with a dawning unease, their certainty shaken by the sight of their neighbors preparing for an act of mercy. Meanwhile, in the snow-shrouded canyons, Nantan faced his own battle. The sickness was worse than the woman had described. The air in the main lodge was thick with the scent of fever and the low, constant sound of coughing. The camp's medicine woman, An ancient, wise elder named Ishke worked tirelessly, brewing teas from willow bark and applying poultices of sacred herbs. Her remedies helped, but they were not enough to stop the relentless progress of the disease. Nantan knew they needed Abigail's medicine, but to ask his people to accept help from a white woman, from the world that was slowly strangling them, felt like a betrayal. He approached the council of elders, his heart heavy. His uncle, a stern traditionalist whose face was a mask of grief over his own sick grandchild, spoke first. "You ask us to trust their magic," he said, his voice raspy. "The magic of the people who break treaties and steal our water, their touch is poison. We will fight this with our own strength, our own ways." "Their ways are different, but they have power," Nantan argued, his voice resonating with a desperate conviction. "I have seen it. This nurse, her hands are guided by knowledge, not by malice. She healed me. She saved my life." "You are one man," his uncle countered. "We are a people. Our strength is in our traditions. To abandon them now is to admit defeat." The weight of leadership settled on Nantan's shoulders, heavy as a shroud. He saw the faces around him, torn between fear of the sickness and fear of the unknown. To bring Abigail here was a risk. If her medicine failed, if people died under her care, the blame would fall on him. He would be seen as the young leader who had forsaken the ancestors and brought ruin upon them all. But to do nothing was to condemn more of them to die. It was a choice between his own honor and the survival of his people. "It is not abandoning our ways," Nantan said, his voice rising with authority. "It is adding to them. Ishke is wise, her knowledge is deep, but this sickness is strong. We must use every weapon we have. The woman, Abigail, she does not seek to replace our ways, but to walk beside them. I have given her my word that she can be trusted, and I give you my word now. This is our best path to survival." His plea, born of conviction and a deep sense of responsibility, swayed the council. They gave their reluctant consent. Nantan sent a messenger, and 2 days later, he met Abigail's small party at the mouth of the canyon. The sight of the camp was sobering. The stark beauty of the snow-covered rocks was marred by the grim reality of the epidemic. Abigail, Esther, and the Reverend were met with silent, wary stares. They were outsiders, their presence a concession born of desperation. Nantan led them to the main lodge, which had been converted into a sick ward. Abigail felt a familiar surge of professional focus. She and Esther set to work, moving from patient to patient, assessing, cleaning, and administering medicine. The Reverend Michael, finding his words useless in the face of such profound suffering, quietly began to chop firewood, his awkward swings of the axe a practical prayer. The most delicate negotiation took place between Abigail and Ishke. Through Nantan's translation, the two women found a common language. Abigail showed the medicine woman how to boil water to sterilize cloths. Ishke showed Abigail which local roots helped soothe a cough and which berries brought down a fever. There was no rivalry, only a shared, desperate purpose. They were two healers, from two different worlds, fighting the same enemy. As the first long day bled into a freezing night, Nantan built a fire in front of the lodge. He did not build it haphazardly. He chose 3 smooth, flat river stones and placed them carefully to form a base for the cooking grate. Abigail, pausing for a moment to warm her numb hands, watched him. The gesture was deliberate, almost ceremonial. "Why those 3 stones?" she asked, her voice soft in the quiet night. Nantan looked at the stones, their surfaces glowing in the firelight. "They are for the foundation," he said. "One is for wisdom, to know the right path. One is for courage, to walk it. And one," he touched the last stone, "is for compassion, to remember why we walk it at all." Abigail looked from the fire to the sick lodge, then to the small team of people working tirelessly within. Wisdom, courage, compassion. It was the creed of their small, fragile enterprise. Just as a sliver of hope began to dawn in the camp, As the fevers of a few children began to break, Maddox made his move. Back in Dusty Creek, under the cover of a moonless night, Boone and 2 other men rode to a small, isolated storeroom used by a rancher who was known to trade fairly with the Apache. They broke the door, scattered sacks of flour and cornmeal into the snow, and set the building ablaze. The next morning, the town awoke to the sight of the smoking ruins and a story, already being spread by Phineas Dole, of a vengeful Apache raid. They had attacked, the story went, to punish the town for their compassion, stealing food and destroying property. The act of sabotage was perfectly timed, a cruel and brilliant stroke. It turned the town's wavering sympathy back into fear and anger. Just as Abigail and her friends were beginning to build a bridge of trust, they were no longer heroes. They were fools who had brought this trouble down on everyone. Their work in the canyon was not just an act of mercy anymore. It was an act of survival on a new and more dangerous frontier. The news of the burned storeroom fell upon the Apache camp like a second sickness. It was a poison of the spirit, turning the fragile hope they had nurtured into a bitter, helpless rage. Abigail Hayes saw the change in Nantan's eyes. The quiet focus he held while tending to the sick was now overlaid with a dangerous fire, a warrior's fury held in check by a leader's heavy burden. He had followed her path of truth, and in return, Silas Maddox had answered with a lie so potent it threatened to undo all they had accomplished. The town, once wavering, would now be united against them. Their act of mercy twisted into a justification for hatred. For a week, they existed in a state of suspended reality. The epidemic had not vanished, but the worst of the crisis had passed. The combination of Abigail's medicine and Ishkay's traditional remedies had broken the fever's grip on the camp. Now began the long, slow work of recovery. Esther Pike and the Reverend Michael remained, their commitment unwavering, their presence a quiet testament to a faith that transcended politics. But the air was thick with the unspoken. They were a small island of cooperation in a vast sea of impending conflict. The supply of willow bark, a key ingredient in Ishkay's fever-reducing tea, was running low. The medicine woman told Nantan of a hidden grove of old-growth trees, located a few miles further down the canyon where a seasonal stream sometimes flowed. It was a difficult place to reach, but the bark there was potent. Seeing the exhaustion etched on Nantan's face, and feeling the need to act, to do something tangible beyond the confines of the sick lodge, Abigail offered to go with him. They set out in the early afternoon, a cold but brilliant sun shining in a sky of pale, washed-out blue. For the first hour, they walked in a heavy silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The path was narrow, forcing them into single file. Abigail watched the steady rhythm of Nantan's stride ahead of her, the way he moved over the rocky ground with an economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime spent in these lands. He was a part of this place, and she was an intruder. The feeling of belonging nowhere, which had haunted her since the wagon train left, returned with a sharp, lonely pang. Finally, as they paused for a drink of water in the shade of a towering rock spire, Nantan spoke, his voice low and rough. He said that some of the younger men in the camp were talking of revenge. They wanted to raid the ranches, to make Maddox pay in blood for his lies. Abigail's heart sank. She said that is what he wants. He wants a war he can win with soldiers and laws. Nantan looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant mesas. He said he knew this, in his head. He knew it, but in his heart, he felt the fire of his ancestors. To do nothing while their name was dishonored and their people were starving felt like a coward's path. She had no easy answers for him. She could only say that courage was not just about fighting. Sometimes, it was about enduring. It was about choosing the right moment, the right weapon. They found the grove of willows in a shallow, sheltered basin. The air was still and cold, and the pale, slender trees stood like silent sentinels. They worked together, carefully stripping long pieces of bark from the trunks, taking only what they needed. The simple, shared task eased the tension between them. the quiet scraping of their knives the only sound in the peaceful grove. It was Nantan who noticed the change first. He stopped, his head cocked, his eyes scanning the southern horizon. A strange, yellowish haze was gathering there, a dirty stain against the clean blue of the sky. The air, which had been still, suddenly became unnervingly quiet, the way a room falls silent just before a blow is struck. "A storm is coming," he said, his voice urgent. "A dust storm. We have to find shelter." They abandoned their work, bundling the bark into a piece of canvas. The sky was changing with alarming speed. The yellow haze grew into a monstrous, churning wall of brown that seemed to swallow the mountains. The sun vanished. The wind began to whisper through the rocks, then moan, then shriek. Nantan grabbed her hand. "This way!" he shouted over the rising gale. His grip was firm, a solid anchor in a world that was dissolving into chaos. He led her at a half-run toward a dark slash in the rock face he had spotted earlier. The first wave of sand hit them, a stinging, blinding assault that scoured their skin and filled their mouths with grit. The entrance to the cave was small, a narrow fissure in the cliff. Nantan pushed her ahead of him into the opening. As she lunged for the relative safety of the darkness, the hem of her sturdy wool skirt snagged on a sharp, jutting shard of rock. She heard a loud, ripping sound and felt herself jerked backward for a moment before the fabric gave way. She stumbled forward into the cave, catching her balance against the rough wall, her heart pounding from the exertion and the shock. Nantan scrambled in behind her, pulling their small bundle of supplies with him just as the full fury of the storm hit. The world outside became a roaring, shrieking bedlam of wind and sand. He pushed a loose boulder partially across the opening, and the sound immediately became more muffled, though the power of the storm still vibrated through the very stone around them. For several long moments, they simply stood in the semi-darkness, catching their breath, their lungs aching from the dust. The cave was not large, a shallow hollow that smelled of cold stone and dry earth. Abigail leaned against the wall, her body trembling with spent adrenaline. She looked down and saw the damage to her dress. A long, ugly tear ran from her knee to the hem, the fabric frayed and ruined. A feeling of profound weariness washed over her. It was just a piece of cloth, but it felt like one more loss, one more thing broken and torn in this unforgiving land. Without a word, Nantan began to build a fire. He had a small pouch with a flint and steel, and he gathered a few pieces of dry, gnarled wood that had been washed into the cave by some long-ago flood. Soon, a small, courageous flame flickered to life, pushing back the darkness and the oppressive cold. The firelight cast their shadows, large and dancing, onto the ancient, curving walls of the cave. The small flame created a sanctuary, a pocket of warmth and stillness carved out of the heart of the storm. In the soft, flickering light, Abigail could see the lines of exhaustion around Nantan's eyes. The dust caked on his high cheekbones. He looked at her, his gaze dropping to the torn skirt. He said nothing, but his expression was one of quiet concern. She sat down on a smooth, flat rock near the fire, trying to smooth the ragged edges of the tear with numb fingers. It felt like a foolish, futile gesture. She felt a sudden, sharp sting behind her eyes. The threat of tears born not of sadness, but of a deep, bone-deep exhaustion of body and spirit. He sat across from her, the small fire between them. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the flames and the distant howl of the wind. He finally spoke, his voice barely a murmur. "You have the heart of a mountain lion, Abigail Hayes. You do not run from the storm." She looked up, meeting his eyes across the flames. There was no pity in his gaze, only a deep, quiet respect that warmed her more than the fire. "I am so tired of storms," she confessed, the words coming out in a raw, honest whisper. "I do not know if I have any fight left." He said, "You have fought for my people. You have fought for me. You have never fought for yourself." The truth of his words settled over her. She had been driven by her duty as a nurse, by her sense of justice, by her anger at Maddox. She had never stopped to ask what she, Abigail, wanted, what she needed. The question hung in the warm, still air of the cave. He leaned forward slightly, his face illuminated by the fire. "I see you, Abigail," he said, his voice soft but intense. "Not the nurse, not the white woman. I see the strength in you that you do not see in yourself. I see the fire in your spirit that matches this one. When I was wounded, you healed my body. But since then, you have healed something deeper. You have made me believe that a promise between two people can be stronger than a treaty between nations." His words were a balm on her weary soul. This man, this warrior from a world so different from her own, saw her more clearly than anyone ever had. He did not see an outcast or a troublemaker. He saw her. She felt the tears finally well in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of recognition, of a profound and overwhelming sense of coming home. She had felt like a ghost, drifting between two worlds, belonging to neither. But here, in this small cave, in the heart of a raging storm, she was not lost. "I have felt so alone," she whispered, "as if I was a stone skipped across the water, touching nowhere for long." He reached across the small fire, his hand open. His fingers were long and strong, his palm calloused from work and weapons. "When you are with me," he said, "you are not alone." She placed her hand in his. His skin was warm, his grip firm and gentle. The connection was immediate, a current of understanding and shared feeling that needed no more words. They had saved each other. They had trusted each other. They had stood together against every storm, both real and of man's making. The feeling that grew between them was as undeniable and elemental as the rock that sheltered them. She looked at their joined hands, then back to his face, his dark eyes holding a question he did not need to ask. Her own heart gave her the answer, clear and certain. She knew what she wanted. She wanted this man, this truth, this feeling of finally, irrevocably, belonging. She squeezed his hand, her voice finding a new strength, a quiet, joyful certainty. "Then let there be no more questions between us," she said. "Take all of me, my whole heart, with nothing held back, and no promise left to doubt." A slow smile touched his lips, transforming his grim, handsome face. The firelight danced in his eyes, reflecting the vow that had just been spoken, a pledge made not with flowery speeches, but with the simple, unadorned truth. He moved from his side of the fire to hers, and she leaned into his strength, her head finding its place on his shoulder as if it were made to rest there. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cave, there was only the gentle crackling of the fire and a deep, profound peace. The flames cast their intertwined shadows upon the stone walls, two separate figures becoming one, their promise carved not in rock, but in light. The promise made in the heart of the storm became a quiet, unshakable foundation in the days that followed. When Abigail Hayes and Nantan returned to the camp, the air between them had changed. It was no longer charged with the tension of two worlds colliding, but with the calm certainty of two people who had chosen to build a new one together. The shared glances, the brief touch of a hand as they worked, the comfortable silences, these became the language of their new reality. A truth that needed no announcement, but the world outside their understanding had not changed, and its judgment was coming for them. It arrived on horseback in the form of Sheriff Caleb Hart, his face grimmer than the winter sky. He brought the official notice a circuit judge, the Honorable Elias Thorne, would be arriving in Dusty Creek in 1 week's time. A formal hearing would be held to settle the dispute over the land claim at Coyote Spring and to hear the lawsuit filed by Silas Maddox against Abigail. The venue for this temple of justice was to be the saloon. The irony was as thick and bitter as the dregs in a whiskey glass. The hearing would take place in the very room that served as Maddox's throne room, a place where his influence was bought and sold with every drink poured. It was a declaration of his confidence, a home field advantage in a game he had rigged from the start. Abigail and Untamed met that night under a sky full of cold, distant stars. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of snow and pine. For the first time, Abigail saw a flicker of something close to despair in Nantan's eyes. "His laws are written on paper that can be bought," Nantan said, his voice a low rumble of frustration. "How do we fight that my people have no paper? Our claims are written in the memories of the old ones and the bones of our ancestors in this ground." "Then we must make the judge listen to the ground," Abigail replied, her resolve hardening into a sharp point. "Your testimony is not just your story, Nantan. It is the story of the land. You must make him see the lines on your map are older and truer than any line drawn by a surveyor." A plan formed between them. Quiet and desperate, Abigail would prepare her own testimony, a factual, clinical account of the sickness and its direct link to the closed spring. Nantan would prepare the story of his people, not as a plea, but as a lesson in history, a map drawn in words. The day of the hearing, Dusty Creek held its breath. The entire town seemed to gather in the wide, muddy street outside the saloon. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sawdust, stale beer, and unwashed bodies. Judge Thorne was a man whose face seemed to have been carved from granite, his eyes weary from dispensing a rough and often inadequate justice across the territory. He sat behind a makeshift bench, a few planks laid over 2 barrels, and called the room to order with a bang of his heavy wooden gavel. Silas Maddox was the picture of confidence, dressed in a fine wool suit. He sat beside his slick, well-paid lawyer from Prescott. His hired guns, including the scarred man, Boone, stood along the back wall, their presence a silent, looming threat. Maddox presented his case with a smug certainty. He produced his deed, stamped and official, a document that claimed ownership of the 160 acres surrounding Coyote Spring. He spoke of progress, of improvements, of bringing order and prosperity to the wilderness. He called his star witness, the reporter Phineas Dole, who eagerly recounted the story of the burned-out storeroom. He painted a vivid picture of a savage, unprovoked attack, twisting the Apache's desperation into an act of aggression. It was a compelling narrative for those who wanted to believe it. Then the judge called for Nantan. A hush fell over the room as he walked to the front. He wore clean deerskin, and he stood not with defiance, but with a powerful, grounded dignity. He carried no papers, no map. "The court recognizes the unusual nature of this testimony," Judge Thorne said, his gaze assessing. "Speak your piece." Nantan began to speak, his voice calm and steady. He did not talk of treaties or rights. He spoke of the land. He raised his hands and began to draw a map in the air for them all to see. "Before the men with chains came to measure the ground," he began, "we followed the paths the deer taught us. In the season of the new grass, we would camp by the river. When the sun grew hot, we moved to the high meadows, and always, his hand swept in an arc. We would come through the pass by Zil-Li-Chi-Yi, the mountain that bleeds, to drink at Coyote Spring before the great hunt." He described the cycles of seasons, the migration of the herds, the locations of sacred sites for gathering herbs. Every story, every memory, was anchored to the spring. It was not just a piece of land. It was the heart of a living, breathing map of survival that stretched back farther than any of them could imagine. He was not arguing ownership. He was teaching geography. The room was silent, the men leaning forward, captivated in spite of themselves. For a brief moment, they saw the valley not as a tract to be owned, but as a home that had been lived in. When he finished, Judge Thorne was quiet for a long moment before clearing his throat. "The court will now hear from Miss Abigail Hayes." Abigail took her place. She met Maddox's cold stare without flinching. She spoke in a clear, steady voice, the voice of a nurse reporting her observations. She detailed the outbreak of pneumonia in the camp. She described the symptoms, the number of sick, the dead. Then, she drew the connection with a stark, undeniable clarity. The sickness began less than a fortnight after the gate was erected at Coyote Spring, she stated, her gaze sweeping from the judge to the faces in the crowd. The people were forced to drink from stagnant pools and melted snow. As a medical professional, it is my assessment that their illness was a direct result of being denied access to clean water. Maddox's lawyer jumped to his feet, objecting, but the seed had been planted. Abigail had not called Maddox a murderer, but she had presented the evidence and allowed the conclusion to form in the minds of everyone present. Her testimony reframed the conflict not as a property dispute, but as a matter of life and death. Judge Thorne, his face unreadable, called for a brief recess. The court will reconvene in 15 minutes to deliver its finding. The crowd began to file out of the stuffy saloon and onto the wide wooden porch, blinking in the gray afternoon light. The tension that had been held in check by the formality of the hearing now spilled out into the open. Maddox stood with his men, a smirk on his face, accepting congratulations from his supporters. Abigail and Nantan stood near the steps, a small, isolated island in the churning sea of the crowd. Esther Pike and the Reverend Michael stood quietly a few feet behind them. Boone, emboldened by the whiskey he had been sipping throughout the hearing, swaggered toward Abigail. "When the judge runs you out of town?" "Nurse," he sneered, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe your savage friends will give you a home in their dirty lodges." A tense silence fell over the porch. The townspeople shuffled their feet, looking away, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. They were caught, paralyzed between the power they feared and the truth they had just heard. Boone took another step, looming over Abigail. "It is time you learned your place." Then, a small sound cut through the silence, the scuff of a boot on wood. Esther Pike, her face pale but her eyes blazing, stepped forward. She did not say a word. She simply moved her body to stand directly between the large, menacing man and the nurse. It was a small, simple movement, but it was an earthquake. That single act of quiet courage broke the town's paralysis. The blacksmith, a mountain of a man who had remained silent until now, moved to stand beside Esther. A rancher whose son Abigail had saved from a snake bite stepped up on her other side, one by one. Then in a small, determined group, others followed. They were not the powerful men of the town, but the ordinary ones, the ones who had benefited from her care, who had been stirred by Esther's bravery, who had heard the truth in Nantan's voice. They formed a silent, human wall in front of Abigail. Maddox's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of disbelief and fury. He had bought the law, but he had not bought the people. At that exact moment, Judge Thorne reappeared in the doorway, his gavel in hand, ready to call the court back to order. He raised it to strike the porch railing. As the wood was about to connect, a sudden, violent gust of wind howled down the street, a phantom of the dust storm. It rattled the windows, kicked up a swirl of dirt and debris, and with a collective sigh, blew out the 2 oil lamps that had just been lit on the porch against the encroaching dusk. The world was plunged into a murky twilight. In the instant of confusion and sudden darkness, one of Maddox's men shoved the blacksmith. A fist flew. The carefully constructed order of the law dissolved into the raw, chaotic energy of a brawl. The judge's gavel finally fell, its sound lost in the shouts and grunts of the fighting men. "Order," he roared, his voice swallowed by the wind. "Order in this court." A deafening crack echoed through the street as Sheriff Hart, his face a grim mask, fired his pistol into the air. The sound shocked the brawlers into a momentary stillness. "That is enough," Hart yelled, his voice cutting through the ringing in their ears. "This hearing is suspended. Go home, all of you." The crowd slowly, reluctantly, began to break apart. 2 distinct, hostile camps glaring at each other across the dusty, darkening street. The question of justice for Coyote Spring remained unanswered, its fate as uncertain as a flame extinguished by a sudden, violent wind. The brawl on the saloon porch was not an end, but a breaking point. The fragile truce of civilization in Dusty Creek had been shattered, leaving behind two camps that now faced each other with open animosity. Law had failed, and into the vacuum created by its failure crept a more ancient and brutal force. Silas Maddox, stripped of his public support and exposed as a bully, fell back on the only power he had left raw: illegal violence. The news came 2 nights later, carried by a young Apache boy who ran through the bitter cold until his lungs burned, his moccasins torn by the unforgiving rock. He found Nantan not in the main lodge, but keeping a solitary watch on a high ridge overlooking the valley. The boy's words tumbled out between gasping breaths, a story of a swift, silent raid on the edge of the camp. They had not come to fight. They had come for one person: Chayton, Nantan's younger brother, a quiet young man of 18 summers, known more for his skill in carving flutes than in wielding a weapon. He was gone. The raiders had left a message, a crude note pinned to a lodge pole with a skinning knife. The script was Boone's clumsy scrawl. It was an ultimatum. Nantan was to come to Coyote Spring at dawn, alone, and sign a document renouncing all Apache claims to the valley and its water. If he did, Chayton would be released. If he refused, or if he brought anyone with him, his brother's life was forfeit. A cold, silent rage, different from any he had ever known, settled over Nantan. It was not the hot fury of a warrior facing an enemy in battle. It was the icy, murderous calm of a man whose family had been threatened, whose love had been turned into a weapon against him. His first instinct was to take his knife and rifle and walk toward Coyote Spring alone, to trade his life for his brother's in a final, bloody confrontation. But the memory of Abigail's hand in his, of their promise in the cave, held him back. This was not a fight he could win with rage. It was a trap, and he knew it. He found Abigail in her tent, cleaning her medical instruments by lantern light. The moment she saw his face, she knew something was terribly wrong. He told her the story in a low, clipped voice, the words tight with contained violence. "He is using my love for my brother to steal my people's future," Nantan said, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "There is no honor in this. He is a snake that kills in the dark." Abigail's blood ran cold. This was a move of pure desperation from Maddox, and desperate men were the most dangerous. "You cannot go alone, Nantan. It is a death sentence for you both." "If I do not go, Chayton will die," he countered. "The logic a merciless trap." "Then we must find another way," she insisted. "Not Maddox's way, our way." She looked at him, her gaze clear and steady. "We need the law, the real law, not the kind written on his forged papers. We need Sheriff Hart." Sheriff Caleb Hart looked older than Abigail had ever seen him. He sat behind his desk, the kidnapper's note spread out under the lamplight, and listened without interruption. When Nantan finished, Hart leaned back, his chair groaning, and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The brawl had been a violation of public order. This was a violation of a sacred, unwritten law of the frontier. "You did not involve a man's family." "Kidnapping is a hanging offense in this territory," he said at last, his voice a low growl. He looked at Nantan, his eyes holding a new respect. Maddox has finally stepped out from behind his lawyers and shown his true face, and now the law has something to grab hold of. He stood up, the decision made. He strapped on his gun belt and took a heavy rifle down from the rack on the wall. "I am not just the sheriff of Dusty Creek's voters. I am the law for this whole valley. Let us go get your brother." Their first stop was the blacksmith's forge. Thomas, the big man who had stood with Esther, was banking his coals for the night. When Hart explained the situation, the smith simply nodded, his face grim. He disappeared into the back of his shop and returned with a shotgun and a heavy coat. Their next stop was the ranch of Jebediah, the man whose son Abigail had treated. He listened to the story, spat on the ground, and saddled his horse. The rescue party was small, a strange and desperate collection of men, an Apache leader. a weary lawman, a silent blacksmith, and a grateful rancher. Abigail refused to stay behind. "You will need a nurse," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And I have an idea." She rummaged through a chest and pulled out a small, canvas-wrapped package. Inside were 3 signal flares she had kept from her time with the wagon train, relics of a life that now seemed a world away. Nantan laid out the plan. Maddox would expect him to approach Coyote Spring from the main trail. They would do the opposite. They would go over Red Mesa, using the high goat trails Nantan knew, and come down on the spring from above. Under the cover of darkness, they would be holding Chayton in the old line shack near the pool, a small, defensible structure. The journey was a descent into a nightmare of rock and wind. The night was moonless, the darkness so complete it felt like a physical weight. A cold, sharp wind began to blow, carrying with it the first stinging grains of sand. Another dust storm was brewing, a malevolent ghost rising from the desert floor. They moved in silence, trusting Nantan's uncanny ability to navigate the treacherous terrain. The path was often less than a foot wide, with a sheer drop into blackness on one side. The wind shrieked around them, trying to tear them from the cliff face. After 2 hours of grueling climbing, they reached a high ridge that overlooked the spring. Below, they could see a single point of light, a lantern glowing in the window of the line shack. They could make out the dark shapes of 2 guards posted outside, huddled against the wind. This was where their paths diverged. Nantan turned to Abigail. "Your light must come from the south ridge," he said, pointing across a deep, dark chasm. "It will make them look away from us. It will draw their eyes to the wrong threat." Abigail nodded, her heart pounding. The task was terrifying. She would have to cross the chasm on a narrow, natural rock bridge and climb the other side. Alone. Esther Pike's husband, Thomas, the blacksmith, looked at her, his face a mask of concern in the darkness. He simply said, "I will go with her." His presence, solid and reassuring, gave her strength. While they made their perilous crossing, Hart and Jebediah found a position for the sheriff, a sniper's nest in a cleft of rock that gave him a clear line of sight to the 2 guards. Nantan, meanwhile, began his own silent, methodical descent down the cliff face, moving like a shadow among the rocks. Abigail's climb was a blur of burning lungs and aching muscles. The wind tore at her, and the sand scoured her face. When she finally reached the summit of the south ridge, she collapsed for a moment, gasping for air. Below, the lantern in the shack looked impossibly small. Taking a deep breath, she opened the package, struck a match against the rock, and lit the first flare. It erupted with a brilliant, sputtering crimson light, painting the entire canyon in a ghastly, flickering glow. The effect was immediate. The 2 guards below, startled by the sudden, inexplicable light, spun around, raising their rifles toward the ridge, their attention completely diverted. In that exact moment, from the opposite ridge, Sheriff Hart's rifle cracked twice. The sound was almost lost in the howling wind. One guard crumpled to the ground. Clutching his shoulder, the other cried out and fell, his leg buckling beneath him. They were neutralized, just as planned. A sheriff's justice, not an executioner's. The red light of the flare died, plunging the canyon back into an even deeper darkness. The time had come for the final signal. From somewhere on the cliff face below Hart's position, a new sound emerged, weaving itself into the fabric of the wind. It was the sound of a flute, a haunting, ethereal melody that seemed to be the voice of the rock itself. It was Nantan, using a small wind flute he always carried. Its notes a coded message that told his allies the path was clear. It was the voice of the land, speaking a language Maddox and his men could never understand. Nantan dropped the last 10 feet to the ground in a silent crouch. He moved to the door of the shack, his knife in his hand. Inside, he found Boone standing over his brother, who was tied to a chair, his face bruised but defiant. "Boone," hearing the commotion outside, was just turning toward the door when Nantan burst in. The fight was short, brutal, and silent. When Hart and the others finally made their way down to the shack, they found Nantan cutting the ropes from his brother's wrists. Boone was unconscious on the floor. Chayton stood up, rubbing his wrists, and embraced his brother in a fierce, silent hug. They had won the battle. They had rescued the hostage. But Silas Maddox, who had been waiting inside the shack for his victory, was gone. Having slipped out the back window during the first moments of the assault, a snake slithering back into the darkness. The darkness that had cloaked their desperate raid began to thin, giving way to the cold, gray light of a false dawn. At Coyote Spring, the wind was a dying whisper, and the silence that followed felt vast and watchful. Nantan finished cutting the last of the ropes from his brother Chayton's wrists, while Sheriff Hart, with the help of the blacksmith, bound the hands of the unconscious Boone and the two wounded guards. Chayton, though bruised and shaken, was whole. For a fleeting moment, a fragile sense of victory settled over the small group, but it was a victory incomplete. Silas Maddox was still a venomous presence in the night. "He could not have gone far," Sheriff Hart said, his voice a low growl of frustration as he scanned the dark, looming shapes of the surrounding mesas. "He is a town man. He will not last long in the rocks." But Nantan knew Maddox. He was not a creature of the wilderness. He was a creature of power, and he had just lost his final shred of it. A man like that does not simply run. He turns for one last desperate bite. "He did not run away," Nantan said, his gaze fixed on the spring itself, a dark, placid eye in the center of the clearing. He ran to his prize, as if summoned by his words. A figure emerged from the deep shadows behind the large cistern that held the spring's overflow. It was Maddox. His fine suit was torn and covered in dirt. His face was scratched, and his eyes held the wild, cornered look of a rabid animal. He had lost his hired army, his legal protection, his public support. All he had left was a pistol, which he now held with a trembling hand, and a capacity for pure, spiteful destruction. He staggered to the edge of the spring, the source of all the conflict, the very lifeblood of the valley. "This is my property," he screamed, his voice cracking with a frantic rage. "Bought and paid for. If I cannot have it, no one will." He raised the pistol, not at Nantan or the sheriff, but aimed it directly down at the large wooden lid covering the main well of the spring. His threat was absolute. He intended to shatter the cistern, to foul the water, to destroy the very thing they were all fighting for. It was the ultimate act of a man who would rather rule over ashes than concede defeat. At that moment, a new sound reached them, the clatter of wagons, the murmur of voices, the tramp of many feet. A line of lanterns bobbed in the pre-dawn gloom, a procession of ghosts emerging from the direction of the town, drawn by the sound of the rifle shots. A crowd of townspeople had come to see the end of the story. Esther Pike was at their head, her face set and determined, and beside her walked the Reverend Michael. Behind them were ranchers, storekeepers, and wives, the very people whose opinion had once been so easily swayed by Maddox's lies. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, a silent, uncertain jury to this final, desperate trial. Nantan stepped forward, away from the others, placing himself between Maddox and the crowd. His own rifle was held loosely at his side, but his presence was a direct challenge. "You own nothing, Maddox," he said, his voice calm and clear, carrying across the cold, still air. "You cannot own the rain, or the sky, or the water that flows from the heart of the earth. You only know how to put a chain on things you do not understand." "I understand the law," Maddox shrieked, his pistol wavering. "I have a deed. I am a builder of civilization. You are just a savage standing in the way of progress." While the two men faced each other, a new and terrible understanding was dawning on Abigail. She was kneeling beside one of the wounded guards, pressing a bandage to his bleeding shoulder. As she worked, she noticed a strange, bluish tint to his fingernails and a faint, almond-like smell on his breath. It was a smell she had encountered once before, years ago, on a man who had worked in a silver mine, a man who had died a slow, agonizing death. Her mind raced back through her memories, through her meticulously kept medical logbook, the symptoms of the sick children in the camp, the severity of the illness that went beyond simple pneumonia, the stories of cattle that had sickened and died after drinking from a downstream pool. It was not just dirty water. It was poison. She stood up, her face pale with a horrifying certainty. She had her medical satchel with her, and from it, she pulled the small, leather-bound logbook where she recorded every case, every symptom, every treatment. It was the weapon she had spoken of, the slow arrow of truth, and it had finally found its target. "He is not a builder," Abigail's voice cut through the tense standoff. "Clear and authoritative. He is a poisoner!" Every head turned toward her. Maddox stared, his mouth agape. She walked forward until she stood in the open space between Nantan and Maddox. She held up the book. "I am a nurse. I record what I see. When the people in the camp grew sick, I believed it was from the lack of clean water. I was wrong. It was worse." She opened the book, her finger tracing a line of neat script. The symptoms were severe coughing, fever, and a debilitating weakness. Yes, but there was also a blueness of the skin, a rapid, shallow breath, and in the 2 children who died, a sickness of the stomach that is not consistent with pneumonia alone. She looked directly at Silas Maddox, her eyes holding him in a steel trap. "These are the symptoms of cyanide poisoning, a chemical used in mining to separate silver from ore, a chemical you would have access to from your other business ventures. Mr. Maddox, you were not just denying them water. You were deliberately seeding the downstream pools with poison, making people sick to drive the price of their land down and to create a panic that you could use to your advantage." A collective gasp went through the crowd of townspeople. The crime was so monstrous, so far beyond a simple land dispute, that it took a moment to comprehend. The truth, once spoken, was undeniable. It explained everything. Maddox's face, which had been contorted with rage, now crumbled with the shock of exposure. His entire world, built on a foundation of lies, had just been demolished by a few quiet words from a nurse's logbook. Sheriff Hart began to walk forward, his hand resting on his pistol. "Silas Maddox," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the law. "In the name of the territory, I am placing you under arrest for kidnapping, assault, and for the willful murder of the people of this valley." Maddox's remaining hired guns, who had been watching from the side, exchanged uncertain glances. They were paid to be bullies, not to be accomplices to a mass murderer. As Hart advanced, the townspeople, led by Esther Pike and the blacksmith, moved as one. They formed a silent, solid line, placing their bodies between the hired guns and the spring. It was a human wall of defiance, a community finally claiming its soul. The gunmen looked at the determined faces, looked at the undeniable truth of the situation, and slowly, one by one, they lowered their rifles and dropped them in the dust. But the confrontation was not over. As Hart reached for Maddox, Nantan raised his rifle. His face was a mask of cold, unreadable fury. This was the man who had kidnapped his brother, who had murdered innocent children, who had brought so much suffering to his people. The law would give him a trial, a hanging perhaps. But justice, the deep, elemental justice of the earth, demanded a reckoning, here and now. The need for vengeance was a physical thing, a fire in his blood. Abigail saw the shift in him, the tightening of his finger on the trigger. The entire future of the valley hung in that single, terrible moment. She moved to his side, her steps quick and silent. She did not grab the rifle. She simply placed her hand on his arm, her touch a gentle but firm anchor in the storm of his rage. He did not look at her, his eyes still locked on Maddox. "Nantan," she said, her voice low and urgent, "meant for him alone. If you shoot, you will lose what you just won the future." Her words cut through the red haze of his anger. The future. A future where law had meaning. A future where their two peoples could live together. Not in fear, but in peace. A future where their children could drink from the spring without being poisoned. To kill Maddox now would be to choose the past, to choose the endless cycle of violence and revenge. It would make him a killer, just like the man he despised. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the rifle. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the fire of vengeance banking into the cold, hard ashes of a choice he would have to live with forever. He had chosen justice. He had chosen the future. Sheriff Hart snapped the iron handcuffs onto Maddox's wrists. The sharp, metallic click echoed in the dawn air. It was the sound of a lock finally being turned, the sound of a chapter ending. The sun broke over the top of Red Mesa, flooding the valley with a clean, golden light. The trial of Silas Maddox was a formality, an epilogue written by the law to a story whose ending had already been decided at dawn by the spring. It was held not in the tainted saloon, but in the town's small church, and the proceedings were quiet, somber, almost funereal. Abigail Hayes's medical logbook was entered as evidence, its neat, clinical script a more damning witness than any fiery testimony. The blacksmith, the ranchers, and even some of the men who had once stood with Maddox testified to his campaign of lies and intimidation. His captured hired guns, facing the gallows themselves, confessed to everything: the fake cavalry raid, the burning of the storeroom, the kidnapping of Chayton. Maddox himself was a shrunken figure, his tailored suit hanging on him like a shroud. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow, venomous silence. When the guilty verdict was read on all counts, from land fraud to kidnapping to murder by poison, he showed no emotion. A man already condemned to a prison of his own making. The sentence was death by hanging, a swift and final justice that left no one in the room feeling victorious. There was only a profound and weary sense of relief. The feeling a body has after a long and terrible fever has finally broken. A week later, Judge Thorne, Sheriff Hart, Nantan, and a newly formed town council met at Coyote Spring. The air was still dry, the threat of drought a constant, nagging presence in the back of everyone's minds. But the sky was a clear, brilliant blue. The ugly wooden gate, a symbol of greed and division, stood as a final, silent defendant. Judge Thorne, a man who understood that true law must be woven into the fabric of a community, did not issue a decree. Instead, he brokered a treaty. The document they drafted was simple and plain-spoken. Coyote Spring and the land immediately surrounding it were to be designated as community property, held in trust for all the people of the valley, settler and Apache alike. Its use would be governed not by fees and chains, but by shared need and mutual respect. It was a small, fragile piece of paper, but it represented a radical idea in that hard land that survival was not a contest, but a partnership. When the signing was done, Sheriff Hart took a heavy crowbar from the blacksmith's hands. He walked to the gate and, with a single, powerful wrench, broke the padlock that had held justice captive. The clatter of the heavy iron lock hitting the dusty ground was a sound louder and more profound than any gunshot. Then, Nantan and the blacksmith put their shoulders to the gate and pushed it open, its hinges groaning in protest. The water was free. Justice, unlocked at last, flowed once more for everyone. That evening, Caleb Hart walked into his office, took off the silver star he had worn for 20 years, and placed it gently on the center of his desk. Abigail found him there a few minutes later, looking out the window at the setting sun, painting the mesas in shades of rose and gold. "You are leaving," she said. It was not a question. "My work here is done," he replied, his voice quiet and content. "I spent years trying to keep a lid on this town, trying to balance the law against what was right. Turns out, I was just keeping the town from finding its own balance. You all did that. Esther, Thomas, you, even him." He nodded toward the window. in the direction of the canyons. You showed them that a community is not about who has the most power, but about who has the most courage. They do not need a weary old man to keep the peace anymore. They know how to do it themselves. He turned from the window, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. I hear there is good fishing up on the Gila River. I think I will go see if the stories are true. He was gone by morning, leaving behind a town that was bruised and scarred, but for the first time, whole. The shadow of Silas Maddox, however, was long. The drought had not ended with his conviction. The earth was still parched, the future still uncertain. Several families, their spirits broken by the conflict and their wells running dry, packed their wagons and followed the sun west, their departure leaving quiet, empty spaces in the fabric of the town. The blacksmith's wife mourned a brother who had been badly injured in the saloon brawl and would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. And, in the Apache camp, there were fresh graves for the 2 children and an elder who had been taken by the poisoned water. Their loss a permanent, aching sorrow. The cost of peace had been high. But where there was loss, there was also a stubborn, tenacious hope. It began with a garden. A few days after the treaty was signed, Abigail saw Esther Pike and Ishkay, the Apache medicine woman, kneeling side by side near the overflow channel of the spring. They could not speak a word of each other's language, but with gestures and shared smiles, they were turning the damp earth, planting seeds of corn, squash, and beans that Esther had taken from her own store stock. Soon, other women joined them, from both the town and the camp. The garden became a common ground, a place where the work of the hands left no room for the prejudices of the mind. The change was most visible in the children. Released from the fears of their parents, they discovered the simple, universal joy of playing in the water. Apache and settler children, their clothes soaked and their faces streaked with mud, splashed and chased each other around the edges of the spring, their laughter a sound of pure, unscripted harmony. They were the first citizens of the new Dusty Creek. Abigail found her own purpose taking a new shape. The small medical tent was no longer enough. With lumber donated by the ranchers and labor from the whole community, they began to build a small, solid cabin not far from the spring. It had 2 rooms. One was a proper infirmary, with clean beds and shelves for her medicines. The other was a schoolroom. Every morning, Abigail would teach the town's children their letters and numbers. Every afternoon, she and Chayton, Nantan's now healed brother, would hold a class for the Apache children, teaching them English, but also encouraging them to write down the stories of their elders in their own language. It was a place of healing, for both the body and the spirit, a bridge built of wood and chalk, and a shared desire to understand. Nantan, too, found a new path opening before him. He had proven himself not just as a warrior, but as a leader who could see beyond the immediate need for vengeance to the long-term necessity of peace. He became the voice of his people, their designated negotiator. He spent his days riding not on war trails, but on the old seasonal paths, meeting with the ranchers, with the map of his ancestors in his mind and a new understanding of the white man's world in his heart. He forged new agreements. He negotiated safe passage for his people during their seasonal migrations and arranged for fair trade of Apache blankets and pottery for the ranchers' cattle and flour. He was rebuilding the connections that Maddox had tried to sever, mending the torn fabric of the valley, one conversation, one handshake at a time. The progress was slow, uneven, and marked by setbacks. Old habits of suspicion died hard. There were arguments over stray cattle and misunderstandings born of language and custom. But the foundation held, the shared memory of standing together against a common evil, the shared work in the garden, the shared laughter of their children by the water. These things had forged a bond that would not be easily broken. The freedom of the West, they were all learning, was not the freedom to take whatever you could hold. It was the freedom to build something better, together. The first breath of autumn had begun to touch the valley, a subtle crispness in the morning air that offered a fragile promise of change. The sun, however, still beat down with the memory of summer's ferocity. And the great brassy sky remained stubbornly cloudless. The drought held its grip, a constant, wearying reality that tempered every hope with caution. Yet, on this day, the people of the valley gathered not in fear or anger, but in a quiet, hopeful assembly. The new building stood near the spring, a testament to a month of shared labor. It was a simple, sturdy structure of pine and river stone, its lines clean and honest against the backdrop of the red mesas. It smelled of fresh sawn wood and new beginnings. This was the day it would be given its life, its purpose, its name. The crowd that stood before it was a mosaic of two worlds. The townspeople, in their Sunday best, stood in a loose cluster, their faces a mixture of curiosity and a hard-won respect. The Apache, led by Nantan and the elders, stood a little apart, their posture one of watchful dignity. They were not one people yet, not truly, but they were neighbors, gathered in the same patch of sun, to witness the same small miracle. Ishkay, the old medicine woman whose wisdom had helped save so many, stepped forward into the space between the two groups. Her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, each line a story, and her eyes held the deep, calm light of a winter star. She held a small clay bowl from which a thin tendril of fragrant smoke rose, the scent of burning sage and sweetgrass that cleansed the air and the spirit. She walked the perimeter of the new building, chanting in a low, melodious voice, her words a blessing on the wood and stone. Then she returned to the center and looked out at the assembled faces. Nantan stood beside her to translate, his voice giving English shape to her ancient words. "This building has been raised from the earth by the hands of all," he translated, his voice clear and steady. "It is a place to mend the body when it is broken. It is a place to open the minds of the young. It is a shelter against the storm. Therefore, it will not have one name, but two. For it serves two peoples. In your tongue, it will be the Dusty Creek Infirmary and School. In our tongue, it is Ij-Anage, the place of healing." A murmur of approval went through the crowd. The two names, one practical, one poetic, fit together perfectly, two halves of a single truth. Then Ishkay turned, her dark eyes finding Abigail Hayes in the crowd. She beckoned her forward. Abigail's heart beat a little faster as she stepped out, feeling the weight of every gaze upon her. She stood before the old woman, a student before a revered teacher. Ishkay dipped her thumb into a small pouch at her belt and came away with a smudge of yellow pollen. She reached out and gently drew a line on Abigail's forehead and another over her heart. It was a gesture of profound respect, an anointing. Again, Nantan's voice filled the quiet. "You came to us a stranger." He translated Ishkay's words, though his own voice was thick with emotion. "You brought your hands, your knowledge, your courage. You did not try to put out our fires, the traditions that keep us warm. You brought a new flame, and you taught us how to tend it alongside our own. You did not just heal the sick. You kept the fire of hope from dying in a time of great darkness. From this day forward, among our people, you will not be called Abigail. You will be called Ndbku, she who keeps the fire." Abigail felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling of being seen, of being known, of finally, truly belonging. She looked from Ishkay's wise, smiling face to Nantan, and in his eyes, she saw not just pride, but a deep and abiding love that was her truest home. After the ceremony, the crowd mingled. The blacksmith, Thomas, unveiled his own contribution, a small, clever water wheel he had built in the spring's overflow channel. It was not large enough for milling flour, but it turned a small grindstone for sharpening tools and, more importantly, it filled the air with a gentle, rhythmic sound of splashing and creaking wood. It was the sound of life, of patient, constructive work. It was the new heartbeat of the valley. As evening fell and the crowd began to disperse, Abigail and Nantan stood on the small porch of the new building, watching the last of the families head home. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening violet sky. A fire had been lit in the stone hearth inside, its warm glow spilling from the windows. "A good day," Abigail said, her voice soft. "A new day," Nantan corrected her gently. He looked from the schoolhouse to the community garden, now fallow but holding the promise of spring, to the gentle turning of the water wheel. "This is our work. This is the world we have chosen to build." Abigail leaned her head against his shoulder, the rough wool of his shirt familiar and comforting. "We will watch the water," she said, her words a quiet vow. "We will teach the children. We will mark the seasons and mend what is broken." He turned his head, his cheek brushing against her hair. "We will stand together," he affirmed. "That is the only promise that matters." Later, when the valley was bathed in the cool, silver light of the moon, they sat before the fire inside their new home. The building was quiet now, the children's voices gone, the scent of chalk and herbs lingering in the air. The only sound was the crackle of the flames and, through the open window, the soft, rhythmic splash and turn of the water wheel. It was the sound of a house that was no longer silent, no longer empty. Abigail looked at Nantan's face in the flickering light, the strong, handsome lines that she knew as well as her own. She thought of their long journey, of the storms they had weathered, both inside and out. She remembered the desperation and the fear in the cave, and the promise that had been born there. She reached out and took his hand, her heart full of a peace she had never thought possible. She leaned close, her voice a whisper against the gentle sounds of the night, repeating the words that had first bound them together, not in a moment of fear, but now, in a moment of absolute certainty. "Take all of me," she said, "my whole heart, with nothing held back, and no promise left to doubt." He brought her hand to his lips and said nothing, for no words were needed. He simply held her as they sat together in the warm glow of the fire they had sworn to keep, listening to the sound of the water turning, the steady, peaceful rhythm of their future. The work of healing was long, and justice, they knew, always came at a cost. But here, in the quiet heart of the West, they had learned that true freedom was not a thing to be claimed, but a responsibility to be shared, a home to be built. One day, one choice, one act of courage at a time. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.